In the fall of 2011, a hunter named Caleb Winters vanished deep within the forests of western Montana. He was 42 years old, a quiet, disciplined man who'd grown up in those woods, who could track elk by the shape of their footprints and tell direction by the smell of the wind. When Caleb didn't return home after a weekend trip, everyone assumed he'd gotten lost in bad weather. But the truth that would emerge 10 years later would reveal something far darker, something no one in his small town wanted to believe. For months, the forest held its silence. No trace of Caleb was ever found. No footprints, no clothing, no rifle, no campsite. It was as if the trees had simply swallowed him whole. The official search began 3 days after he was reported missing. At first, it was routine: helicopters, search dogs, dozens of volunteers combing through Glacier National Forest. They covered more than 60 square miles. Nothing. No heat signatures. No broken branches. No signs of struggle. Just endless pine, fog, and cold. Caleb had left home on the morning of October 12th, 2011. He told his wife, Lena, that he'd be back by Sunday. It was supposed to be his last hunt before winter. He drove out in his red 2003 pickup, loaded with gear, a tent, and his father's Winchester rifle. He called his wife that afternoon to say he'd reached the ridge and that the weather was perfect. That was the last time anyone ever heard from him. By nightfall, the temperature dropped below freezing. The following morning, a storm rolled through, thick snow, near zero visibility. When Caleb didn't return by the 14th, Lena called the sheriff's office. Search and rescue began immediately. They found his truck parked at a Forest Service gate off an unmarked logging road. Inside were empty snack wrappers, a half-drunk coffee, and his hunting license sitting neatly on the dashboard. The keys were still in the ignition. The truck hadn't been tampered with. It was like he had stepped out for a moment and never came back. What puzzled searchers most was that there were no tracks, none leading away from the truck, none toward it. Fresh snow had fallen during the storm, but even under that, nothing showed through. They sent in dogs. They caught a scent trail about 30 yards north of the vehicle, then lost it abruptly near a frozen stream. After that, nothing. Lena drove out every day to the search site, waiting near the truck, hoping he'd just walk out of the trees. She refused to believe he was gone. Caleb wasn't reckless. He was methodical, careful, and knew every trail in that forest better than anyone. He'd been hunting there since he was 15. He never strayed from familiar terrain. Over the next 2 weeks, hundreds joined the search. They found his boot prints once, a single line leading up a steep incline toward the ridge. But they stopped suddenly on hard rock. No prints leading back down. It was as if he'd reached the top and vanished into the air. By November, the snow made searching impossible. Authorities suspended operations and declared the case open but inactive. Locals whispered their own theories, that Caleb had slipped into a ravine, been attacked by wildlife, or wandered too far in wide-out conditions. But nothing matched his experience, and no remains were ever found. Years passed. The forest reclaimed the search zones. Caleb's truck was eventually towed and impounded. Lena refused to sell it. She said she couldn't touch it. It still smelled like him. Every year on October 12th, she drove back to that same gate, left flowers on the ground, and waited in silence. By 2018, most had moved on. People said time had done what it always does, covered the wound. But for Lena, it hadn't healed anything. It had only made the questions louder. Then, 10 years later, almost to the day, the forest finally gave something back. In October of 2021, a group of hunters from Spokane were hiking through the same region. They followed a deer trail up toward a high ridge, a path nearly identical to the one Caleb had taken a decade earlier. About 2 miles off the main route, one of them noticed something odd, a faded patch of orange buried under dead leaves. When they brushed the dirt away, they realized it was a piece of nylon fabric. A tent. It was old, weathered, and half collapsed, but still standing. When they opened it, they froze. Inside was a sleeping bag, a small camp stove, and a metal cup, all arranged neatly. Beside the stove lay a rusted hunting knife, a pack of cigarettes, and a notebook sealed in plastic. And next to that, a leather wallet. Inside the wallet was an ID. The name read Caleb Winters. When authorities arrived, they cordoned off the site. Everything inside was preserved under layers of dirt and frost, almost untouched by time. The strange thing was how close the camp was to where they'd searched. Only 1.6 miles from his truck, an area that had been combed by multiple teams, dogs, and drones. Yet, somehow, they'd never found it. The discovery reignited the case. After a decade, investigators were finally back in the forest, this time with modern tools. They found the campsite intact, but no sign of human remains. Caleb's rifle was leaning against a pine tree outside the tent, pointed toward the ridge. The safety was off. The barrel was clean. He had fired it recently before disappearing. The gunpowder residue confirmed it. Near the tent's entrance, they found 3 shell casings in the dirt. Each was fired from his rifle, but no bullet impact sites could be located nearby. The bullets were gone. No animal blood, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if Caleb had fired 3 shots into empty air. Investigators ruled out distress signals. The space in between shots wasn't consistent with an SOS pattern. It looked more like defensive fire, as though he'd been shooting at something. But at what? The area was silent, lifeless. No bear tracks, no cougar prints, no drag marks. Just an untouched clearing that hadn't been disturbed for 10 long years. Then they opened the notebook, and everything changed. The first pages were what you'd expect from an experienced outdoorsman. Notes on the weather, hunting patterns, and daily entries about routes and supplies. But the last few pages, dated October 13th, were different. The writing was shaky, uneven, hurried. One line read, "Saw movement across the stream last night. Too big to be deer. Watched me for hours." The next entry said, "Heard footsteps after midnight. Not mine. Thought it was an echo, but it circled the tent." And then the final line, written in ink so faint it was almost gone. "It's back. I know what it is now. If I don't make it out, tell Lena I stayed quiet." No one knew what he meant by, "I stayed quiet." Investigators photographed the pages and sent them for analysis. The ink was confirmed to be over 10 years old. There was no sign of tampering or forgery. It was his handwriting. But the last sentence, those 5 words, felt like a message or a confession. The sheriff reopened the case, calling it one of the most baffling cold cases in Montana history. And within weeks, something new was found. A piece of evidence that had been there all along, buried under 10 years of silence. Something that would finally explain what really happened to Caleb Winters and why the truth had been hidden for so long. The rediscovery of Caleb Winters' camp set off one of the most detailed forensic searches Montana had seen in years. For a decade, his story had been a whisper in town. A missing man, a mystery lost to snow. But now, the forest had returned to pieces. And they didn't fit the version everyone had been told. The first thing investigators noticed was the condition of the tent. Despite 10 harsh winters, the fabric hadn't deteriorated as much as expected. Experts said the angle of the trees and the layer of fallen branches above it had shielded the site from wind and snow. Everything inside looked strangely preserved, like time had paused. Even the coffee tin on the camp stove still carried the faint smell of roasted beans. The most haunting object was the notebook. Those last words, "If I don't make it out, tell Lena I stayed quiet," echoed through every interview, every report. Stayed quiet about what? Forensic teams began mapping the area. 10 years of snowmelt had changed the landscape, but the ground near the tent still told a story. About 30 feet east of the campsite, under a layer of soil and pine needles, they found something metallic. At first, they thought it was debris. When they dug it out, they realized it was a motion-activated trail camera. Old, waterlogged, its casing cracked. But the brand and model matched the one Caleb's wife had confirmed he owned. when the data card was recovered. Technicians were stunned to find that a handful of photos had survived. Only 3 of them were visible. The first showed Caleb crouched beside a fire, his rifle beside him, looking into the distance. The timestamp read October 12th, 9:42 p.m. The second image, taken about 2 hours later, showed the same clearing, empty. No Caleb, no firelight, just mist, and in the far corner of the frame, a shape, a man, faintly visible, standing between the trees. The camera had triggered again 20 minutes later. The final image was pitch black, except for one thing, 2 small points of light, like eyes reflecting in the dark. But when those photos were analyzed at higher resolution, investigators found something even stranger. The figure in the second photo wasn't a stranger. It was another man wearing camo gear, standing half-turned toward the camera, and slung over his shoulder was a rifle. That revelation changed the case overnight. If someone else had been out there, Caleb hadn't vanished alone. He'd been watched. Detectives cross-referenced the image with hunting permits and park records. No other hunters were authorized in that area between October 10th and 15th. Whoever that man was, he hadn't been there legally, and the more investigators looked into it, the more they began to suspect that Caleb had known him. Lena confirmed that Caleb often hunted with a small circle of friends, mostly locals from Whitefish and Kalispell. One of them was Evan Blake, a contractor and part-time guide. He'd been close to Caleb for years. But what most people didn't know was that the two had recently fallen out over a business dispute. Caleb had invested money in one of Evan's land projects, a hunting lodge venture that collapsed. The friendship ended with anger and debt. In early 2011, just months before Caleb vanished, the two reportedly argued in a bar in town. Witnesses said Caleb called him a thief. Evan told him to stay out of my woods. No one thought much of it at the time. When investigators reopened the case in 2021, they brought Evan in for questioning. He denied everything, said he hadn't hunted that fall, hadn't been near Glacier, hadn't spoken to Caleb since the argument. But when detectives checked the state's hunter tag database, they found an entry under Evan's name for October 11, 2011. The tag had been marked for District 282, East Ridge boundary, the same section of forest where Caleb's truck had been found. When confronted, Evan claimed it was a clerical mistake, but the timestamp of the permit application matched exactly, and his cell phone data, what little was still retrievable from old records, pinged off a tower in that area that same week. Detectives searched Evan's property. In his basement, they found a box of old gear, compasses, ropes, knives, and a broken trail camera, the same brand as the one recovered from Caleb's site. When they brought it to the lab, it didn't take long to find what they were looking for. The serial number on the broken camera matched the one listed in Caleb's old receipts. It had been part of a pair, 2 cameras purchased together. One was found at the site. The other was in Evan's basement. That connection broke the case open. For 10 years, everyone had believed Caleb had simply gotten lost. But now it was clear someone else had been there. When questioned again, Evan's tone changed. He admitted that he and Caleb had gone hunting together that weekend, but claimed they had split up after a disagreement. He said Caleb insisted on taking the North Ridge alone, and he'd returned to his truck the next morning. He claimed he waited several hours, then left after assuming Caleb had taken another route out. Detectives didn't buy it. They confronted him with the recovered photos. He stared at them for a long time, then said quietly, "That's not me." But his hands shook as he said it. The sheriff called it the most controlled lie he'd ever seen. Forensics teams kept digging. They expanded the search perimeter another half-mile from the tent site, scanning the soil for traces of disturbed ground. And on the second day, about 70 yards north of the camp, they found something, a shallow depression in the forest floor. When they cleared away the roots, they uncovered what appeared to be a small grave, just 2 feet deep. Inside were fragments of bone, a rusted belt buckle, and a piece of flannel fabric. DNA testing confirmed it. The remains belonged to Caleb Winters. 10 years of waiting ended with a body, but the answers were still missing. His bones showed no signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no fractures, nothing to indicate a struggle. But one strange thing stood out, a clean circular hole through the breast pocket of his jacket. Not from a bullet, but from heat. The edges were charred, almost melted. Forensics believed something extremely hot had pressed through the fabric, and the material fused inward. The coroner couldn't determine cause of death. Caleb hadn't been shot. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't frozen. He'd simply stopped. What confused investigators most was how his remains had ended up in that shallow pit. It wasn't an animal burial. The grave had been dug with a spade, deliberate, human. Someone had buried him. And the only other man known to be there was Evan Blake. When detectives returned to question him again, he was gone. His truck was missing. Neighbors said he'd left town overnight after hearing about the recovery on the news. He'd told his girlfriend he was going back to fix something. They never saw him again. 3 weeks later, his truck was found abandoned 50 miles north near a closed logging trail. The driver's door was open. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside, they found mud, camping gear, and Caleb's missing pocket knife. In the glove compartment was a folded letter. It was addressed to Lena Winters. The first line read, "You deserve to know what really happened that night." The letter found inside Evan Blake's abandoned truck was soaked in rain, but most of it was still legible. It began simply, no greeting, no apology, just a story. A confession written by a man who'd spent 10 years trying to live with what he'd done and failing. He wrote that he and Caleb had set out together that October morning, driving into the forest in separate trucks. They planned to hunt elk near the North Ridge, the same area they'd scouted for years. But things between them were tense. The argument that started months earlier over money, betrayal, and pride hadn't faded. Evan said Caleb never forgave him for losing the lodge investment. And when the two finally met at the trailhead, their friendship was already broken. According to the letter, they camped together the first night. Evan described Caleb as distant, distracted, as if he'd come not to hunt, but to make peace with something inside himself. He wrote, "He kept saying he wanted one last quiet hunt before the season ended, but I could tell something else was on his mind." The next morning, October 13th, they separated. Evan took the western slope, Caleb the ridge to the east. Before leaving, Evan said Caleb looked him in the eye and said, "If we don't come back at the same time, promise you'll tell Lena I wasn't angry anymore." It was the last time he saw him alive. Evan's letter went on to describe what happened that evening. He had been heading back toward his own camp when he heard 3 distant gunshots echo across the valley. He thought Caleb might have spotted an elk, so he made his way toward the sound. By the time he reached the ridge, the forest was silent. He called out Caleb's name. No answer. He followed the direction of the shots until darkness fell. Then he saw the orange glow of a small campfire between the trees. When he got closer, he found Caleb's camp, the same one discovered 10 years later. The fire was nearly out. The tent flap was open. Inside, Caleb sat slumped forward, his rifle across his lap, his eyes wide open. Evan said he called his name again, but Caleb didn't respond. When he stepped closer, he realized something was wrong. There was no blood, no wound, but Caleb wasn't breathing. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. The air around him smelled faintly burnt, like metal. Evan didn't know what had happened. Heart attack, lightning, something else. But the moment he touched Caleb's jacket, the fabric was still warm. He wrote, "I remember pulling my hand back because the heat burned my palm. There was a hole in his coat right above the pocket, and the inside was black." That matched what investigators found a decade later. The melted fabric, the burn mark. Evan said panic set in. He had no cell signal, no radio contact. The storm was closing in. He didn't know what to do. He sat with Caleb's body for over an hour, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. Then he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He buried him. He wrote that he couldn't bear to leave him exposed in the storm. The ground was frozen, but he dug a shallow grave with his spade. He wrapped Caleb's coat around him, whispered a prayer, and promised he'd come back for him in the spring. Then he took Caleb's rifle and notebook, thinking he could deliver them to Lena himself. But fear kept him from ever doing it. He said, "I should have gone to the sheriff. I should have told the truth. But when I got back home, I realized no one would believe me. 2 men go into the woods. One comes back. One doesn't. I would have been finished." So he said nothing. He stayed quiet. The same words Caleb had written in his notebook. Evan's letter went on to describe how guilt consumed him. Every October, he drove back toward the forest, but never crossed a boundary. He couldn't bring himself to face it. He kept Caleb's knife as a reminder, the same knife found in his truck a decade later. He wrote, "I thought I could live with the silence, but silence grows teeth. It bites at you until there's nothing left." Then, in the final page, he revealed the moment that broke him. 2 weeks before writing the letter, he said he'd gone back to the old site, not to hide anything, but to make peace. He found the camp exactly as it had been left, half buried under years of snow. He said it looked like the forest had protected it. He stood there for hours, waiting for the wind to say something back. When he turned to leave, he heard a sound behind him, a single gunshot echoing from the ridge. He looked back, but there was nothing, no smoke, no light. He said, maybe it was memory, maybe it was punishment, but it followed me down the trail. The letter ended there. No signature, no apology, just a line at the bottom that read, "It's time to stay quiet now." Forensics confirmed the paper was recent. The handwriting matched samples from Evan's past records. There was no doubt he had written it. But when search teams combed the area near where his truck was found, they never located him. No footprints, no body, no sign of where he'd gone. It was as if he'd vanished into the same silence he'd described. The sheriff officially closed the case in 2022, ruling Caleb Winters' death as undetermined natural causes. Evan Blake was listed as missing, presumed dead, but those who worked the investigation knew better. They said the truth of the case wasn't about foul play or accident. It was about guilt, and how silence can become heavier than any secret. When Lena read the letter, she didn't speak for a long time. She simply folded it and said, "He kept his promise." He stayed quiet. She didn't mean it in anger. She said it like a prayer. In the years that followed, the story of Caleb Winters faded from headlines, but in the small towns around Glacier, it became something of a legend. Hunters told it around fires, about the man who disappeared and the friend who buried him out of fear. Some said Evan had wandered back into the forest and never left. Others said he'd finally found the courage to finish what guilt wouldn't let him do for 10 years. But the truth stayed buried where it began, under the same trees, beneath the same soil, where the wind still carries the faint smell with smoke every autumn. Today, the ridge where Caleb's camp once stood is closed off. No one hunts there anymore. Locals call it the quiet place. And sometimes, they say, when the fog is low and the forest is still, you can hear a faint sound, a shovel against frozen ground. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's something else. But for those who knew the story, they say it's just the past finishing what guilt left undone. Because in the end, the forest didn't take Caleb Winters. Fear did. Fear buried him once. And silence buried him again. 10 years later, the truth came out. Not because the mountain wanted it to, but because guilt never stays quiet forever. It waits, patient and cold, until someone is brave enough to dig it back up. The case was solved. But for the people who lived through it, for the wife who waited, and for the man who confessed too late, the silence never ended. And maybe that's what the forest teaches us. That some secrets don't disappear when we bury them. They lie in the dirt, listening, waiting for the right season to speak again. And when they do, they whisper the same thing every time. That no one really vanishes. They just go quiet,